Okay, so we are going to be doing a critique of a fellow brother, a fellow psychonaut, and he fancies himself as a decolonizing thinker. So I'm going to be critiquing his supposed decolonial perspective. He has this kind of white guilt, and I'm going to be showing him what real decolonization is all about. In my defense of Terence McKenna, that are going to be talking about here, his critique of Terence McKenna, although this person, explains himself as a psychonaut and, supposedly an expert in the field, I also consider myself both an expert in psychonautism and as well as decolonizing. And I think that in his criticism of Terence McKenna, he's way out of line, both in his failure to actually do a decolonizing critique, but also in his repetition of idioms. What he's doing is basically my critique of the whole prescriptive intersectionality line, where everybody's just repeating the same lines over and over again without actually doing the actual critique. If you saw my Carrie Bursaw video, it's kind of a similar in terms of how people just do land acknowledgement by reading a piece of paper without actually doing an actual land acknowledgement, an authentic land acknowledgement when you're actually there. I'm not the one who's making this critique as an outsider, non-native person. These are actually native critiques. If you actually go out and do the reading and find some critiques of these land acknowledgements. But I think that this person right here is a really good example. But I don't want to single him out. I'm just, he's a fellow brother, he's a fellow psychonaut, and he cares about decolonization. Amazing, thank you. He's already more in tune with what's happening in the world than what's actually taking place. We don't need no education. It's so disturbing how the university is just pushing out all of these thinkers who could have been really good thinkers, but instead they end up just reproducing the same kind of empty rhetoric. This person, I think he's a good thinker, but what I'm asking for is something more than the social capital virtue signaling form of anti-racism that's become the norm. This kind of white guilt anti-racism. In a way, it's a patronizing anti-racism, and I want to end this. And that's why I'm doing the hashtag decolonization.
One of the most well-known concepts from American psychonaut and philosopher Terence McKenna, what he called the archaic revival. Quickly before I start, please consider subscribing if you haven't already, as it is a free way to help this channel.
So subscribe to me
now
as
that you're
well.
Subscribed, let's get into it. The archaic revival is the theory that so-called Western culture has grown sick, and that it's in the process of reverting to an older, left-behind style of living in order for the earth and humanity to heal. Here's that concept in Terence's own words.
And we created history, slavery, standing armies, urbanization, monotheism, monogamy, materialism, militarism, and all the other isms that are destroying the planet. And so the way back is through a kind of archaic revival. And the whole of the 20th century has been about this. Everything from jazz, surrealism, psychoanalysis, abstract expressionism, rock and roll, house music, body piercing, tattooing, all of these things are impulses to go back to how it was before history.
So there are a few aspects of this theory that I'll be critiquing today, trying to sort through where I think he was on the right track and where I think there are flaws.
So you're going to be critiquing the great Terence McKenna, my friend, my young friend.
As well, such as metaphysical Gaianism and his old time wave theory, that I'll save for another time in order to focus on these three main items. One is that Western culture is becoming sick, and all the isms that Terence lists that cause that. Two is that old archaic styles of living are healthy and superior. And three is that Western culture is, in his words, like a prodigal son, and is in the process of returning to that archaic state. The first, Western culture being sick, I think is true. That what we call Western culture, which, let's be real, essentially means white culture.
Weird. I don't think it's just white culture. I don't think it's white culture at all. Okay? What he's talking about, this sickness of our culture, is actually this postmodern condition. A postmodern condition is global. it's global in scope. So to illustrate this, I'm going to be reading a note to a professor. My observation is that our generation lives in a world of confusion and paradoxes. In China, this is an era of materialism, an era without faith. After the Cultural Revolution, which completely destroyed traditional Chinese culture, Chinese people found it hard to adjust to the new realities. I don't think that rampant materialism in our generation is completely our fault. After all, what else can we believe? Party doctrines, Western liberalism, love, justice, kindness? After the ebbing away of the revolutionary frenzy, many Chinese discovered that the power of money is the most concrete and the safest thing to believe in. This is the postmodern condition, my friend. The postmodern condition is one where between all of the various religions in the world, between all of the noise, the only thing that speaks is this neoliberal colonialism. And funnily enough, it's coming through the blandness of, I'm so sorry to say this, but the blandness of not just your decolonial critique, but the blandness of academia altogether today as well, which is my modus operandi. See, the problem is this neoliberal logic has where all of our relationships are a matter of cost-benefit analysis, where the academic institutions, the psychological institutions, all of our institutions repeat this same line and at the same time try to put that logic within and wrap it up within Marxist Engelsian analysis or wrap it up within progressive capitalism. That's the postmodern condition, my friend. So the postmodern condition is not just white or Western culture dying. Western culture died a long time ago, okay? And you know how how we know it died? We know it died because Sam Harris and all of these guys had a conference called Defend the West, Defend the Dying West conference. That's how you know it already died years ago, okay?
True that what we call Western culture, which, let's be real, essentially means white culture, is, for lack of a better term, toxic. And what I mean by that is that it's greatly harmful.
Toxic. Again, these idioms that are repeated, how they are brainwashing our students today is just unfathomable and immoral. Actually, it's infuriating that they're creating these white guilt liberals that are coming out of the university and trying to help us decolonize
the ecosystem, and is currently destroying all hope for a bright future, or for any future. Where I disagree with Terence is in what is causing this culture's toxicity/sickness. Some of the isms that Terence lists I do agree with, and some I don't. But he misses what I and many others believe is the ultimate ism that is destroying our world. Say it with me, kids. Capitalism. And it seems to me that Terence was hesitant to acknowledge capitalism's role in this toxicity, though he kind of got close when he said bottom line is.
Actually, Terence does talk about capitalism, maybe not in this particular clip that you mentioned, but Terence does talk about it.
Perhaps we'll discuss Terence's political position another time.
Our unhappy, addicted, ego-driven condition has become not simply the source of our own unhappiness. That was bad enough. But now it's the source of great discomfort and dislocation for all life and human society on the planet. We are out of control. We are basically severely addicted to things and cannot stop ourselves. And we know, or we should know, that there is not enough petroleum, heavy metal, so forth and so on in the planet to give all the thing addicts all the things that we know they must have in order to be happy.
Well, what's wrong with the operating system that we have? Consumer capitalism 5.0 or whatever it is. Well, it's dumb. It's retro. It's very non-competitive. It's messy. It wastes the environment, it wastes human resources, it's inefficient, it runs on stereotypes, it runs on stereotypes, it runs on stereotypes, it runs on stereotypes, it runs on stereotypes.
But for now, we have to do the obligatory paragraph of why capitalism is the problem, because some of y'all seem to want to push back against that. I read every comment. I know I shouldn't, but I do. Definition of capitalism: an economic and political system in which a country, trade, and industry are controlled by private owners for profit rather than by the state. What I mean when I talk about capitalism is a social system that prioritizes above all else profit, as in capital gain through means of privatization.
And what I mean by neoliberalism is the state that creates this culture where the market itself is a site of verediction, how Foucault defines it. Because all of our gods are dead, because we live in a world where your ancients, Plato, all of the ancients don't tell us anything about how to live properly. Your religions can't tell you anything about how to live properly. The only religion that actually is able to make a return on your investment, the only religion that is able to answer your prayers, is the one of participating in the market sphere. Okay, that's the only religion that actually answers your prayers. So if you do the hard work, if you participate properly, you could buy your Lamborghini. You could get your dream of that Lamborghini or whatever the heck that you wanted, right?
This is known as the discovery doctrine, and the term terra nullius, land belonging to no one, was used in places like Australia. Imagine if dibs was how the world was run. Oh wait, militarily enforced dibs. Much of this...
Actually, it wasn't dibs. It was worse than that. It was actually getting people to sign pieces of paper that they had no idea what the heck it was. So Shana Zuboff, for example, makes an amazing comparison between how we sign away our rights when we're using these social media platforms and the chiefs in several native societies in the world that would sign a piece of paper. The reason why they had to sign a piece of paper is that the English or whoever had to show to the other Europeans, look, this land is ours, so don't come here because we've already made a deal with this particular chief. But the chiefs perhaps may not have any idea of what private property means, just like we have no idea what the heck we're doing when we're signing these legal disclaimers when we're signing up for Apple or Google or whatever.
Much of the settler propaganda maintained the narrative that this new world was empty and waiting to be populated. The truth is, it already was. There were hundreds of millions of people who lived there with a way of life that was much different than their own. Now for the second component of Terence's thought, archaic values. I have to assume that what Terence is referring to when he says archaic values is actually indigenous values. Indigenous political structures differ to a fair degree across what is now known as the Americas, and those structures were greatly affected by European colonialism. But
my friend, so what decolonization means for white people, because I'm from the Caucasus, I am the original Caucasian. So what it means for white people to go through a process of decolonization is exactly what Terence is doing. So Terence has done a lot of work in terms of this archaic revival. So what Terence is actually pointing to is Marshall McLuhan's idea of the global village. And Marshall McLuhan is an intelligent man who predicts the internet, and he predicts that global tribalism will come back. And there is indeed an archaic revival in that sense, how we are all going back to pagan cultures, how
their social systems were based on working within and for the greater ecosystem. European powers equated indigenous people with nature, which they saw as something to be tamed and exploited. Once European powers took the land as their own, indigenous peoples and ways of life were to be eradicated, and what couldn't be was to be assimilated into the greater, superior capitalist system. Content warning here, I'm going to be talking about some upsetting genocide-related stuff, so if you aren't up for that right now, you can skip to this timestamp. That brings us back to the third component of the archaic revival, the return or revival of archaic values in Western culture. I think there is a big flaw in the language used here, the implications of the time element. Sure, indigenous ways of life have existed for a long time, but it complexly evolved and changed over that time, just like Western cultures did. It flattens and erases much of indigenous histories to suggest that the ways they continue to exist, in spite of an assimilatory culture, is archaic.
Okay, so what Terence is talking about is not within the last 500 years. Okay, what Terence is talking about when he's talking about an archaic revival is to go back to Greek pre-ancient times, okay? Archaic revival is this, he's trying to go back way deeper than this, right? That's what, DMT does, okay? What white people need to do to decolonize is not this kind of "I'm so sorry for my white guilt" videos. What they need to do instead is to look back in time to their own history and to realize the moments in which, when did the European colonizers start to colonize? Around the 1400s, around the 1200s, 1300s, when they were at war with one another. Okay, and these wars with one another in this small land called Europe, where they started to, this competition amongst one another, where they needed extra resources to have these wars with one another. So from that, around in that time, the 1400s, right, where all of these things are happening, 1200s, 1300s, that era is really important for white decolonization. Okay.
Within these values, but rather they never left. Indigenous peoples were dehumanized by colonizers in large part by utilizing myths, such as the claim that indigenous cultures were primitive, reinforcing the myth of racial hierarchies.
So Terence is not even talking about any of this stuff. You see, because actual critique is so censored in academia today, that the platforming straw man is the norm. I mean, Terence is not talking about this time era. He's talking about a pre-Greek, a pre-ancient time. And this is this kind of straw man making is what the academics are doing mostly, these undergrads, and even Judith Butler does with regards to Cornell West, right? So
colonizers, such as guns and ships, was used as evidence to affirm their perceived cultural superiority. Out with the old and in with the new, they say, but even if we were to flip the script and say old is gold, embrace tradition, that really begs the question, which old tradition are we returning to? This is why we need to be able to use dialectic and intersectional analysis when it comes to complex issues such as this. We can't just say old good, new bad, or old bad, new good. These simplified approaches can't appropriately assess the situation.
The only simplified approach, my friend, is this intersectionality that is supposed to solve problems of incommensurability, that is supposed to solve problems of complicity, that holds up this power equals privilege, noble savage narrative that you are doing from the back door. Okay? There is no noble savage, okay? There is no noble savage. Native people had wars with one another, okay? And they had bloody wars with one another, okay? What you have to do, again, is to look at your own history, your own white colonial history, pre-colonial history, understand what was the motivation beyond gun, germs, and steel. What was your motivation for doing that? Because right now, a lot of people just say guns and germs and steel. That's a problem. So there was this psychological thing that was happening in Europe around the 1400s. What Terence is talking about, my friend, is something called Babylon, okay? In the hippie world, we call it Babylon, okay? Let me school you for a second. Babylon is the code of Hammurabi, an ancient code, an ancient civilization. And that's what decolonization really means. To, once you dig in and you go back to that 1400s and you keep going back, you do ancestral lineage work, you do spiritual work, and you get to that code of Hammurabi, and you get to the pre-Abrahamic times, right? For me, I go back to the Zoroastrian times, to even the pre-Zoroastrian times. Okay, that's what the archaic revival is. It's to go back beyond the Greeks, beyond what Plato and Aristotle in their works, they call upon the ancients as well, right? So to going back to what Plato and Aristotle are calling the ancients. That's what this revival is all about. Of course, much of it isn't actually doing the hard work that that requires, the hard spiritual work, the hard emotional labor that goes into that. What instead ends up happening is a lot of these idioms that are going around. Right now, we live in a time, right before the British invasion of India, there was a time when there was in India a time of too many gurus. And right now, we are living in that same time, my friend, and you're participating in that too many gurus explanation. I'm also participating in the too many gurus culture that we've created. And guess what? That's the archaic revival, right? That's what he's talking about. What he's talking about is what Marshall McLuhan talked about with regards to internet culture reviving the tribalism of our world. And it has revived the tribalism in our world, not always in a good sense, right? We already have revived the tribalism in our world. Marshall McLuhan nor Terence McKenna are doing what you're doing, which is doing the noble savage narrative. Unfortunately, what you don't realize, and what probably all of the producers that help you create this video don't realize, is how you're upholding the noble savage narrative through the back door. How you are bringing racism, this patronizing racism, through the back door. I'm not calling you a racist. It's not even you that's doing it. It's a whole culture that's doing it, right? Sorry about...
as a return to archaic values, but rather the switching of allegiance to existing alternative models as a way to begin to rectify the tremendous harm to humanity and the earth that has been perpetuated by the dominant colonial system. An archaic revival, I think, has the serious potential of mythologizing and appropriating marginalized groups, and that the more effective way of seeing the issue is by striving to be decolonial allies.
You see, my friend, repeating idioms is not being an ally. I'm telling you now, you're not anybody's ally by repeating idioms. The only ally you are of is the ally of neoliberal colonialism, a new form of colonialism, the most intense, most sophisticated form of colonialism that there exists today. Okay, by repeating these idioms, by doing land acknowledgements without actually acknowledging the land, by reading a piece of paper without actually doing the spiritual work needed to sit there and actually acknowledge the land for whatever video or whatever event that you're doing, to participate in the rituals in your everyday life.
And that the more effective way of seeing the issue is by striving to be decolonial allies, meaning we should open dialogue and really listen to what indigenous voices in our areas and abroad are saying, and avoid the trap of speaking or acting on their behalf. I say to myself, it is going to take a lot more than tattooing, rave dancing, and abstract art to decolonize this shit, fellow psychonauts.
So, just to end this video, Terence McKenna is doing the hard work of decolonizing. He is not doing some strawman version of noble savage narrative. When Terence McKenna talks about archaic revival, it's not that white people don't have an access to an archaic. Not only that, but there is already an archaic revival happening, the one that Marshall McLuhan talks about, and in fact, the one that Terence McKenna is referencing. That is about the global village. That's already happened. It's already happening, that you and I are a part of. We are both gurus in a world of too many gurus. Guess what? That is the archaic revival in itself. The archaic revival is not some strawman version of a noble savage narrative. In fact, what you are doing, my friend, in assuming that native peoples don't have wars, or in repeating the idioms that you were taught in college, rather than going and doing your own critical assessment of your own historical lineage and unraveling what Heidegger, the Nazi, calls unconcealment, unconcealing your own history of European ancestry, and trying to see what was it that motivated this whole destruction of nature that we are seeing today. So my friend, if you want to be a quote ally, you don't repeat idioms, neoliberal idioms. What you do instead is you go and search upon your own history and have an authentic relationship with, or try to create. I'm not saying you don't have an authentic relationship. I know you're trying, but in your repeating of idioms, there's no authenticity there, for me anyway. What you should do is instead look into your own history, look into your own heart, look into your own family history, and try to fully distinguish what is your burden from the burden of other people. And then you can have an access to what this collective trauma really means. And then you can, in your everyday life, create or be responsible for the collective rituals that we are creating together in an authentic way. So how do you create authentic collective rituals? There's something called the liminal sphere. The liminal sphere is kind of what's behind me right now. The liminal sphere is an in-between space. An in-between space when you are enacting the ritual of, for example, the land acknowledgement, but you don't do it in a way that's too rigid, and you don't do it in a way that's too fluid. How you do it is you are in a way enacting that ritual. So thank you for taking the time to listen, and dear brother, thank you for your hard work. And remember, to critique is to love, and I'm not trying to throw any unnecessary mud on you. What I am trying to do, however, is to show others how much of these neoliberal idioms that we keep repeating, incorporated into our hearts and our relationships with one another, is not helpful. And in fact, it alienates. The other thing that you could be doing is going to your cousins, your white cousins that live in Mississippi, and actually taking up the emotional labor to talk and convince them and to talk about their own history. That's what family lineage is important. You have to be decolonizing yourself. One thing that you can be doing to heal from your ancient history, from your colonial history, is to go back not to necessarily native ancient history, but your own ancient history, pre-Socratic, pre-Babylonian history, pre-Abrahamic history, and try to read on those subjects and try to connect with the ancestors in that way. Try to read those fragments. And then you can see that in fact we do all have very similar rituals, right? In our earliest rituals, we would all sit around the fire, no matter what religion you were part of, no matter what tribe you were part of. There was a time when all apes at some point sit around the fire. We all enact that ritual, right? So we do have a oneness there. And my more radical opinion here is that Native people have to do much, or at least Native people in the Western world or in Australia have to do much less decolonizing work than white people have to do. Right? It's the white people that have to do more decolonizing work because they have a longer history of intergenerational trauma, right? Perhaps, right? Because their trauma, the wars, the European wars, the Crusades, all of those wars and that led to gun, germs, and steel was a much heavier burden than, for example, the native wars, right? So some of us have to do a lot more work in terms of decolonizing than others do. Some of us have much more of a decolonial journey to go through. So for you to decolonize is to study your own European history, to talk to your cousins, and do the emotional labor of teaching your own cousins this stuff, and not repeat the same narratives that you hear in universities that tells you this is how you be an ally, this is how you can do stuff. No, come up with your own authentic version of allyship. That's what it means to truly take up the emotional labor necessary to participate in today's crushed, destroyed, and whatever sliver of public sphere that there is left, that's what it means to decolonize. Thank you for listening, my friend, my brother, and I hope that you will continue on this journey, and I'll maybe see you in the psychonat world.